Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/EntitledPeople, where people truly believe that the world is all about them and nobody else matters. And in today's episode, guys, it's all about horrible family members and their entitlement. So if you've ever dealt with or have entitled family members, oh boy, this one's for you guys. You'll be shaking your heads so hard in this one. I hope you enjoy the stories. Subscribe if you're not subscribed, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. So this happened back in 1999, and a similar story you told reminded me of it. My uncle was always a piece of work, and he wasn't just a blatant thief at times, but he was a major entitled cheapskate to boot. When I was 13 back in 1999, I got a brand new Nintendo 64 for my birthday, with a racing game called Mario Kart to go with it. My cousin, who was a complete spoiled brat at the time, was all over it the next time he came to visit. Now the kid wasn't really so bad, but he'd get violence if he lost at a game, or he didn't get something he wanted. I was playing my N64 in my room when he asked to come in. I didn't mind. I figured I could race against him at Mario Kart. We played the first circuit race, and since I owned the game, I was pretty good at it. He came in last each time. Of course, being a spoiled brat, he totally lost it. He was crying that I wouldn't let him win, and then he starts punching me. The kid was like 7 years old, and he was really physical. He liked to aim for the crotch and neck when he hit people, as Dad taught him how to fight. The kid just barely missed hitting me in the junk, so I dragged him out of my room. When I told my uncle what my cousin had done, his response was, "So? Why didn't you let him win? He's younger than you. No excuses. He's little. Let him win." So that's when I suggested a compromise of letting my cousin play by himself so he could get some practice in at the game. Everyone agreed, and I thought that would be that. Well, clearly being young and having anger issues, while he was playing by himself, he got mad and he throws the controller against the wall. I tried to tell him to calm down and that it would take some time and he needs to play more. He'll get better. He then said he couldn't practice because he doesn't have a Nintendo at home, because his dad won't buy him one. All I said was I was sorry about that and decided it was time to shut the game off because I didn't want to risk something getting broken. My little cousin then went crying to his dad that he wanted a Nintendo 64. My uncle told him they didn't have the money, so I figured again that was it. They left not too long later, and this is where it goes downhill. About an hour later, I went back to my room, and that's when I noticed my Nintendo was gone. I immediately called my parents, and my dad was furious. My mom tried to make excuses for her brother because he was a single father and that we should give him the N64. I protested, and my dad was even more against the idea. I'll never forget, my dad packed us all into a station wagon and we drove to my uncle's house. He was swearing the whole way. When we got there, my dad pounded on my uncle's door until he finally opened it. My dad then demanded they return the games and console immediately. My uncle actually denied having it until we pointed out that we could hear it as my cousin was playing with it full volume. So after being caught and called out on it, my uncle just slams the door in our faces. My father pounded on the door again and then threatened to call the police if he didn't return it, and then yelled he still had the receipts so police could tell it was mine. That's when the N64 stopped playing and I heard my cousin start screaming. That's when my uncle comes out with the N64, the cords, and both controllers in a plastic bag, and he practically shoved it in my hands. He then slammed the door shut, saying we're no longer family. Meanwhile, my little cousin was still screaming and trying to open the door, but my uncle wouldn't let him out. I checked everything in the car, and one of the controller's joysticks had been broken. My parents did apologize to me, and they said my uncle wouldn't be welcome in our house for some time. Then, they took me to the local game store and they bought a replacement for me. A few months later, we found out my uncle was jailed for trying to steal from a store. Now, I don't remember what he tried to take, but my mom did decide to file a petition for custody of my cousin without asking my father, which led to a big argument. We ended up taking my little cousin anyway, and over the next year or so, we unspoiled him. His father never bothered to come back for him, so he sort of became like my little brother. This was decades ago, and I haven't seen my uncle since, and his son did turn out to be a pretty good guy. He's still terrible at Mario Kart though. What an ending that was, hey? Never expected that at all, and I'm actually glad it worked out the way it did. Cousin going to live with OP's family is probably the best thing that could have happened to him, because if he were to stay with that thieving entitled uncle, who knows what he'd be up to now, right? With that said, I just love the part where Uncle steals from them and then has the audacity to scream that they're no longer family when OP's family just wants their property back. Don't you just love entitled family members? Okay, so this story is extremely hard for me to tell because I'm still feeling the effects from it. However, I feel like I need to because this story features the most entitled person that I've ever met in my entire life. This is the story of how my life has been ruined because I refused to pay my fiance's mother $5,000. It starts out simple enough. Back when my fiance and I were dating, my parents wanted me to leave the house as I'm getting, quote, too old to be still living at home. They told me this in a very abrupt manner, and they expected me to leave fairly quickly, giving me no time to prepare. My fiancé kindly asked his mom, who he was staying with, if I could live with them, long enough for us to get an apartment together. He also stressed to her that it would be difficult for us to get an apartment ourselves, just starting out, and that while we could cover the monetary expenses, we would still likely need a co-signer. She then promised both me and him that if we couldn't qualify for an apartment by ourselves, that she would co-sign for us. So I moved from Illinois to Florida. And within a week of me being in the house, my fiance's mother made our lives a living hell. Despite me landing a job within a week and having to work late nights for said job, she would come into the living room each morning at varying stupid early hours to tell us that we need to do something productive and start demanding we do chores for her. She would also gaslight and pick petty fights with my fiancé, and then play the victim like a true narcissist. It actually got so bad that a few weeks in, we decided to rent a hotel room for the weekend, just to get away from her and have alone time. We thought that since we had our apartment picked out anyway, all we'd need to do when we got back was sign paperwork and we'd be away from her, right? Well, wrong. After the weekend, fiance's mother drove us back to her house. On the drive back, she sprung something on me. She said she wanted us to pay her $5,000. Now, for some context, my fiancé was going to be receiving a $9,000 medical settlement a few months from that point. Before he met me, he told his mom that if he was still single, he would give her $5,000 toward a trailer that they would both own and live in together. Since my spouse and I were dating and we were very serious at the time, this was extremely confusing that she would demand this. My fiancé then tried to explain to her that he only promised to give her money if he was single. But mom was not having any of it. She attempted to gaslight him about it. When that didn't work, she turned to me and she requested I pay her the $5,000. I only had about $5,000 in my bank account at the time, so I couldn't do that. Well, when she realized that she couldn't squeeze blood from a stone, my fiance's mother finally declares, "Well, I guess you don't have a co-signer then. Good luck getting that apartment now." Well, with my fiancé being out of work and disabled, with me making minimum wage and her refusing to co-sign this apartment, that essentially left us without any housing options. The rent in our area is very high, and finding a roommate situation that accepts couples is near impossible. Renting houses were also out as well, once again due to not having enough income. With that, my fiancé's mother's behavior worsened. With nowhere to go, we just jumped ship and we moved to a local hotel. But only 3 months of this drained our finances. We then couch surfed with some of my fiance's acquaintances, but a lot of them were not good people and we were used and stolen from several times. We ended up sleeping in a deep freezer of an abandoned Hooters until the building was almost torn down on us by construction workers one day. After that, my fiance's mother bought us a tent. How nice of her. And we end up living in the woods while I tried to hold down my job. With that said, we've been homeless on and off for 2 years now, and we've been in dangerous situations many times. My fiance's mother does not care. It even seemed like she enjoyed watching us suffer, all because she was refused the money. Finally, one day, we were practically begging on our knees. My fiance's mom co-signed this apartment, a 2-bedroom model we couldn't afford, but she insisted it was that or nothing. But after everything was finalized, she told us that we couldn't have roommates to supplement the rent. We had to try to keep ourselves afloat. When our lease ended, fiance's mom insisted that she fulfilled her promise, so she has no obligation to help us, even if that action led us to the streets again. We're homeless again now, and she continues to lie about us to the rest of the family. saying we ruined the apartment, which we left in perfect condition, saying that's the reason she won't co-sign for us again. So to tie up the story, I found out recently that refusing to co-sign and watching our finances dwindle was very much intentional on the mom's part. During the weekend that my fiance went to the hotel for the weekend escape, his mother went to a family get-together. During the family event, someone actually joked that I probably had more money than my fiance's mother, and she took that personally. According to a family member, she calmly said in response, "Let's see how much money that bitch has when I'm done with her." So yeah, the post ends right there, guys, but what an evil, evil woman she was, right? Like, the fact that she did that to spite them and to teach them a lesson makes her a frickin' monster. And seriously, I want to ask who in their right mind would do that to someone, let alone their own child, to make them suffer on purpose. But at this point, I've read way too many stories to where I'm not even surprised when stuff like this happens. And this person comments what I'm sure a lot of you are thinking. This person says, "Dude, call your family and get a plane ticket to Illinois. Why have you lived out of a tent for years when you've had a job and enough money to afford 2 plane tickets? Where's your family? Who were you living with before you moved there? Why haven't you moved back home yet?" So yeah, of course, there's a lot of questions that we'll probably never get the answer to. I just hope OP's doing well. But guys, let me know what your thoughts are. A lot of people in the comments are telling OP to just leave that guy and his mom and to get as far away from them as possible. So I have an almost endless supply of entitled parent stories. I work in advising at a very expensive private university. Today, I was reminded about the most epic one. So let me tell you about one Karen and her super embarrassed son, who we'll call Phil. Karen was the ultimate helicopter parent with no boundaries whatsoever. In spite of living cross-country from the university, she came with Phil to orientation, and she moved into a hotel on the edge of campus for the entire first semester. There was not one meeting or event I ever held that semester that Karen did not try to crash. It all started during orientation. She escorted poor Phil everywhere and demanded her own name badge that said Phil's mother on it, so she'd be let into orientation events. When we wouldn't make her one, she went to Staples and she got them to print one for her. The woman threw 16 kinds of fits, demanding her own university ID that would let her access the dorms, which is massively against every policy we have. She tried having Phil claim his was lost so she could get a second ID of his. Apparently the concept that we would deactivate the lost one escaped her. It actually got so bad that we had to call the police to the dorms to get her to leave and stop beating on the door to be let in every morning. The woman also demanded a university email account so she could directly access our learning management system. We declined, and then she went to the help desk and she threw such an epic fit about needing to keep an eye on Phil's work that the police had to escort her out. It must be absolutely exhausting to be Karen. Karen also showed up at the first advising group meeting, and she insisted on coming along to the dinner I was taking them on. I tried my very best to tell her that wasn't happening. Students only. She then went on a screaming tirade about how much money she spent on tuition and how dare I separate her from her baby because he'd never been anywhere alone before. And yes, I completely believe that. The woman literally followed us to the restaurant. She grabbed a spare chair and she pulls it up to the table where my group was seated. She then tried to order for Phil and herself, and the second the server came to the table, I informed the server she was not with our party, that I wasn't paying for any of her stuff, and could she please be removed as she was very much unwelcome. Nobody else brought their mother, and poor Phil was completely mortified as Karen was kicked out of a popular local restaurant, screaming the whole way. The first advising meeting, where we register students for classes, was a real trip. Karen, of course, shows up with Phil, and she throws a screaming fit how he hadn't gotten into a very popular class that was lottery only, and no freshman ever got into this class. I, of course, told her that, and the whole time, she stands outside of my office door screaming at me for being so stupid. The screeches could probably be heard 3 buildings away. She additionally wanted me to get him into a phys ed class immediately, one that hadn't even had registration yet. The crazy lady was standing outside my door screaming how he needs to take fencing for a good 20 minutes while I tried to register another student. She eventually got asked to leave by the police again, and every single time she would loudly yell at them that she was just standing up for her baby boy. Another event that I took the crew to that year was a baseball game, and sure enough, Karen tries to RSVP. I informed her students only. She then informs me that Phil wasn't allowed to go without her, so there better be a ticket for both of them. I was again firm in replying students only, but she showed up. The woman threw another fit and literally ripped a ticket out of one of the kids' hands, and she took off with it. It was a sold-out game. I didn't have extras. Now, I don't know how Karen thought this would end, but I'm a season ticket holder. One quick call and that ticket was canceled and a replacement was waiting for us. I was later told by my season ticket rep that she threw quite the tantrum at the gate when her ticket didn't work. Phil never did join the rest of us in the stands. Of course, on top of that, she tried to follow poor Phil to classes. And one time, she even showed up to a professor's office to yell at them about assignments and grades. Now, I didn't see any of that myself, but word did get around when she was finally arrested. Karen then finally went home and she stayed there Christmas break. According to Phil, the hotel was sick of her and they wouldn't extend her reservation any further. I can only imagine what a nightmare she was to them. Apparently, that was enough to get her to leave for good. Poor Phil never quite lived down the horrible reputation he got as a result, but at least he escaped her at last. So the moral is, don't be a Karen. Just drop your kid off at orientation, buy them a mini fridge, and then go home. Phil turned out fine, by the way. He graduated, has a good job, and not much of a relationship with Karen anymore. Yeah, I can't say I didn't see that coming, guys. Like, going no contact with a parent like that, who would have thought? And seriously, I couldn't imagine the embarrassment that Phil must have felt when his mom basically harassed everyone that entire first semester. That is not a good look, especially when you're an adult and going to frickin' university. This happened when I was 15 years old. My mom was, and let's be real, probably still is, a mentally, emotionally, and physically abusive, entitled narcissist. She treated us horribly as kids. Some highlights are when she was teaching my twin sister and I to read at the age of 4 or so, and she kept whacking her with a sandal every time she got a question wrong. The same thing happened with me. When I was 13, I told her I wanted to live with my dad, as they were divorced, and she told me she didn't care what I did after I turned 18. I later figured out that this was because of child support. It stops at 18. Anywho, fast forward to 15. Our relationship was understandably strained. We had guests, and she liked to use guests as a way of controlling our behavior through shame. It's easier to be an angsty teenager when your grown-up friends from church aren't watching and judging everything you do. This makes it easier for her to pretend to be a firm but loving mother, all the while she's slipping in sideways comments like velvet daggers. Well, I decided that I wasn't going to subject myself to the whole thing, and I spent the day outside in the woods nearby. When I saw the guests leaving, I went to go back inside. Well, my mother, unhappy at being denied a day-long emotional abuse routine, told me I wasn't welcome in her home anymore and that I should leave. My 15-year-old brain heard the words and knew she only meant for a little while, but I also recognized that she failed to specify any time frame at all. So I hiked a couple of miles to a friend's house and asked if I could spend a couple of days there. When my friend's dad found out that I was there and why, he was pissed, and he said that I could stay as long as I needed. So I didn't go home that evening or the next. My mom then became concerned and she contacted law enforcement to report me missing. This is a big deal for several reasons. We lived in the mountains on a national park, so it was a very real possibility that I was attacked by a wild animal, or became injured while hiking, or drowned, or been kidnapped. Nobody knew of my mom's abusive tendencies or the squalor and neglect my sister and I lived in. Most importantly, the law enforcement was the local park rangers, with which she worked daily. Law enforcement immediately contacts my dad's side of the family to see if I turned up there or contacted them. They promptly freaked out and they came to my house with lawyers on standby. Law enforcement then hired dogs to track my scent, and then everyone freaks out because the dogs tracked me to a nearby river where my trail died because the dogs couldn't pick up any more scent. The next couple of days, there were people going in and out of my house, rangers, lawyers, my family, etc. Several noticed the overpowering scent of cleaning chemicals, but only the lawyer considered why a clean house would reek of chemicals. Law enforcement then starts to canvass the nearby woods and the neighborhood. My friend's dad came to me and asked if there was somewhere else I could stay. He told me that he wouldn't kick me out, but he didn't want to have to lie to the police or let dogs on his property. My friend and I figured that we would just go camping for a week or so, but instead, I looked up my dad's side of the family and then called and they picked me up right away. Understandably, everyone had questions. When I told them what was happening, the lawyers were horrified and they pounced. A judge issued an emergency change of custody and prevented my mom from gaining custody until she underwent a psych eval and therapy, which my mother would never allow. The Rangers, equally horrified, completely shunned my mother, and she eventually lost her job. And since she was only allowed to live on the park because she worked there, she was kicked out of her house. My friend's father and the trackers were also members of the local community and churches, and they too shunned my mother. In the end, my entitled mother lost her job, her house, her church, and her friends, all because she told me to leave, and I did. What a frickin' fallout, guys. Losing absolutely everything. I bet the mom didn't expect that to happen when she told OP to never come home again. And some would even say that's karma at its finest. I also want to add that it really took guts for OP to do something like that. And for all who are wondering, OP's life got so much better being away from mom. Again, who'd have thought, right? Like being away from a horrible person, your life is just way, way better. So this is a long story, and I hope it's worth your time. In spite of being full grown and having a family of my own, the scars of growing up with an entitled father still rear their ugly head once in a while. This particular event was one that in all likelihood saved my life. I share it now to pay respects to the beloved grandfather who stood up to my dad. This also happened many years ago, but it was monumental enough to stay with me forever. I was home in Texas for a visit as my dad was stationed in Germany. So by this point, I was 15 years old, and I was suffering emotional problems due to the abuse that my dad was heaping on me. I was withdrawn, my hair was starting to fall out, and I had constant panic attacks. My sweet grandparents could see that I wasn't well. I had been treated poorly my whole life, and secrecy and denial were embedded in my psyche. When they asked me if my dad had done this or that, my knee-jerk response was to deny, deny, deny. After 3 weeks, my 16th birthday comes around. My mom agreed to extend our stay long enough for me to be in the States to celebrate. Now, my grandfather had the habit, since I was a young girl, of heading down to the local cafe every morning to have a coffee with a group of men from the community. I never thought anything of it, nor did anyone else. This was his coffee time. End of story. So one day, not long before we were due to fly back overseas, my grandfather asked me if I would go to coffee with him. I politely declined, as who wants to go watch a bunch of old men drink coffee at 7 o'clock in the morning? He gave me a strange look, and he told me I was going with him the next day, that he would make sure that I got up in time. And I'm thinking, okay, sure, Granddad. We then got to the cafe, and it was exactly what I pictured. It was about 7 old men, some in suits and some in coveralls. Granddad then grabs my elbow, and he guides me to a table with a well-dressed, imposing-looking man. As soon as we sat down, he looked at me with the kindest eyes that I've ever seen from a stranger. We spent 20 minutes talking, mostly about my life in Germany. I then went home, and I thought nothing more about it. My birthday was 4 days later. Then it was time to get ready to go back. My grandfather took me out the next day to get a new pair of shoes, but I was shocked when he pulls up at the courthouse. He then turned to me and asked, point blank, if I really wanted to go back. I said I didn't, but I really had no choice. And he replied, what if it was your choice? I then said again I didn't have a choice. I was terribly frightened of my father's wrath. With that, he opens my car door and he guides me inside the courthouse. We end up in an office, and a judge walks in, the same man I spoke to at the cafe. I was stunned, but he and my granddad had been friends for years. He then said to me, so, young lady, I understand from your grandfather that you wish to be emancipated. Now, I didn't have the first clue what that word meant, but I knew if my granddad said I did, I should agree. So I nod, and the two of them start talking a mile a minute. They would look at me every now and then, and all I did was nod. I knew something big was happening, but I didn't understand what. When we left, Granddad told me not to say a word to anyone, especially not my mom or brother. That night, he asked my mom what she thought of me staying in Texas and starting school there. She of course balked at the idea. That night, she calls my dad, and he gets on the phone with me, and he told me I'd better not try anything cute. That I would be on that plane or he'd have me put in a mental hospital. I went and told my granddad what he said, but Granddad just smiled and told me to get some sleep. The next morning, I was up at the crack of dawn, and Granddad told me to get in the car. I remember being so excited and frightened because I knew something was up. In 20 minutes, I was in front of the judge, nodding and saying, "Yes, sir," to everything he said. We then walked out, and Grandpa told me that I was going to be very brave and to trust him to tell me what to do. He then took me to a little furnished apartment, and he told me to stay there. Granddad then went home, and he told my mom that I wasn't going anywhere near her or Dad again. He then hands her some paperwork. Of course, she freaks out, and she calls Dad, who then called Granddad. And in his most entitled manner, he told the old man that he didn't know who he was messing with, and that if I thought he was going to let me walk away from him, he would make sure I was locked away until she's 30. I can make it happen. That's when Granddad told him if he ever came back to his town, there would be a group of men with shotguns waiting for him. My mom and brother left the next week. I never said goodbye because my granddad said there was no need to let them back in your head. I was an emancipated minor at the age of 16. At 17, I joined the Air Force. I miss my granddad so much, but I hope he died proud of what he'd done for me and who I became. Yeah, I'm 1000% sure Granddad is proud because I'm a complete stranger and even I'm feeling proud of OP. Like, Granddad sounds like such a wonderful person, not to mention a frickin' badass as well. If you dare show your face here, we'll be waiting with shotguns. It's always good to have a person like this on your side, right? And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our /entitled people. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy, crazy stories. And if you missed the last episode on the channel, it's in our /entitled people episode, where Karens think they can't be arrested. It's such a wild episode. So go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.